It was February 19th, 1974, and the Tonight Show band had already begun its warm-up run when Johnny Carson leaned across his desk, pointed a pen directly at Lucille Ball, and said something that nobody in Studio One at NBC Burbank was prepared to hear. "Lucy," he said, his voice low enough that the studio audience couldn't quite catch it, but sharp enough that every crew member within 10 feet went still. "I'll bet you can't do it in 10 minutes. Not anymore." For a moment, no one moved. Ed McMahon's smile, that broad, reliable, professionally cheerful smile that had anchored 1,000 awkward moments, froze somewhere between amused and alarmed. A production assistant standing near camera 2 stopped writing mid-sentence. The band's warm-up faltered just slightly, as if the musicians themselves had heard something wrong in the air. The studio audience, already settled into their seats, felt a shift they couldn't name. Something had changed in the room. Something that had nothing to do with the show and everything to do with the two people now looking at each other across that famous desk. Lucille Ball was 62 years old. She had the red hair and the sharp eyes and the kind of presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around her when she walked in. She had made 60 million Americans laugh so hard they forgot their troubles. She had built a television empire with her own hands when the industry told her no woman could. She had survived scandal and divorce and Hollywood's particular brand of quiet, smiling cruelty. She was, by any measure, a legend. She did not flinch. She looked at Johnny Carson, the undisputed king of late night, the man with the power to make or destroy careers before midnight, and she did not smile, and she did not deflect, and she did not reach for the safety of charm the way she usually did when things got uncomfortable. She just looked at him, and the studio held its breath. "Prove it," Johnny said quietly. "Stay with us," because what happened in the next 10 minutes didn't just silence a studio audience. It changed the way Lucille Ball saw herself, and it reminded Hollywood that real greatness doesn't age. It waits, but that moment didn't start there. To understand why those 6 words landed the way they did, you have to go back. Not just to the beginning of Lucille Ball's career, but to the particular kind of woman she had become by 1974, and the particular kind of fear that had begun very quietly to follow her. It was 1951 when America first met Lucy Ricardo, a young redhead on a brand new television set, tripping over herself, scheming her way into situations no sensible woman would enter, making the country laugh until it hurt. The show was called I Love Lucy, and within 6 months of its premiere, it was the most watched program in the United States. Within a year, it was a phenomenon. Within 2, it was a part of American life the way Sunday dinners and baseball were a part of American life, something people didn't just enjoy, but needed. Behind Lucy Ricardo was Lucille Ball, and behind Lucille Ball was something the audiences rarely saw. A woman of ferocious intelligence and iron discipline who had fought for every inch of what she built. She and her husband, Desi Arnaz, had co-founded Desilu Productions in 1950, against the advice of every studio executive who told them the idea was foolish. Desilu would eventually produce not just I Love Lucy, but Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Lucille Ball, in 1962, became the first woman to run a major Hollywood production studio. She had done it, not by asking permission, but by making permission irrelevant. But by 1974, something had shifted. Not in Lucy, in the world around her. Television had changed. Audiences had changed. The critics who once treated her as untouchable had begun writing about her work in a new register, a cooler one, a more cautious one, her Variety series. Here's Lucy had ended in 1973 after 6 seasons, and while it had run a respectable course, the reviews in its final year contained a word that lodged itself somewhere deep in Lucy's chest and refused to leave. Labored. One critic had used it just once in a single review. But in Hollywood, one word from the right person in the right publication can echo for years. And Lucy, for all her confidence and capability, had heard it. She had folded the review. She had kept it. Johnny Carson had read it too. Johnny Carson had built his entire career on reading people. Not the surface version of people, not the polished, publicist-approved, talk show-ready version, but the real one underneath. The one that showed itself in an unguarded pause, a flash of genuine emotion behind rehearsed charm, a moment when the mask slipped just enough to reveal the actual human being sitting in the guest chair. That was what Johnny did better than anyone who had ever hosted a television program. He found the truth in people, and what he had seen in Lucille Ball's recent appearances troubled him. She was still funny. She was still sharp. She still commanded every room she entered with that particular brand of authority that only comes from decades of complete mastery. But there was something careful about her now. Something controlled in a way it hadn't been in the early years, in the years when she was falling off furniture and stuffing chocolates in her blouse and throwing herself into chaos with the kind of fearless, total commitment that made America love her. The wildness had been replaced by precision. The danger had been replaced by reliability. She was still very good, but she was no longer astonishing. Johnny didn't think she'd lost it. He thought she'd buried it. 3 weeks before the February taping, he had called his producer, Gary Nunn, into his office and closed the door. He didn't bring notes. He didn't have a formal plan. He had an idea. And the idea was simple and slightly reckless and entirely Johnny Carson. He wanted to dare Lucille Ball to be herself again, live, on camera, in front of millions of people. Without a script, without a safety net, without the careful architecture of preparation she had come to rely on. Gary Nunn had stared at him for a long moment. She might walk off, he said. She might, Johnny agreed. But she won't. The morning of the taping, Lucy arrived at NBC Burbank at precisely 10 o'clock, composed as always. Talking points prepared, stories selected, laughs positioned. She was ready for the Tonight Show she had been on 3 times before. She was not ready for what Johnny had planned. If you've ever been told you couldn't do something you'd spent your whole life mastering, stay with us. Because what happened next was for every person who ever needed someone to believe in them first. The first 2 minutes of the interview were exactly what everyone expected. Johnny complimented her. Lucy deflected with grace. The audience laughed in the right places. The conversation moved along its familiar groove, warm, practiced, safe. And then Johnny set down his pen, folded his hands on the desk, and leaned forward in the way that people who watched The Tonight Show had learned to recognize. It meant something was coming. "Lucy," he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." He reached beneath the desk. He placed 3 items on the surface between them, a rubber ball, a long silk scarf, and a single chocolate wrapped in gold foil. The audience recognized the chocolate immediately. A ripple of laughter moved through the bleachers, nervous and delighted. The conveyor belt scene from I Love Lucy, the one that had aired in 1952 and never stopped being talked about, was one of the most famous moments in American television history. And here was one gold-wrapped chocolate sitting on Johnny Carson's desk like a dare-made physical. 10 minutes, Johnny said. No script, no plan, just you. Lucy looked at the props. She looked at the audience. She looked back at Johnny, and for 3 full seconds, she said nothing. Ed McMahon would later tell people those 3 seconds were the longest of his professional life. She reached out. She picked up the chocolate, unwrapped it slowly. She placed it in her mouth, looked directly into the camera, and then Lucille Ball disappeared. And Lucy Ricardo came home. What followed has been described by people who were in that studio in terms usually reserved for things that cannot quite be explained. She began small. A slight difficulty rewrapping the chocolate, a mild confusion directed at the rubber ball, and the first row erupted. Then she escalated. Not quickly. The way a storm builds. The scarf became tangled. Ed McMahon started laughing before she'd done anything because he could see where she was going. Johnny Carson put his hand over his mouth and turned away from the camera. He could not stop laughing, and he did not want America to see him lose control. But America saw. And America loved it. At the 9-minute mark, Lucy stopped, stood perfectly still, looked at Johnny with an expression that was not Lucy Ricardo's at all. It was Lucille Ball's, clear, direct, 62 years old, and completely, devastatingly alive. "Still got it?" she said. The studio fell silent. Then Johnny Carson stood up. Not the way a host stands up to signal a commercial break. Not the way a professional stands up out of obligation or courtesy or the mechanics of live television. He stood up the way a man stands up when he has just witnessed something that has reached past his defenses and touched something real, slowly, without thinking about it, and the entire studio rose with him. 400 people on their feet, the sound building from silence into something overwhelming, a wave of applause that a crew member standing in the back later described as the loudest thing he had ever heard inside a building. Lucy stood in the center of the stage and let it wash over her. She didn't take a bow. She didn't perform gratitude. She just stood there, the scarf still around her neck, and for a moment her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lights. But what nobody in that audience knew, what nobody watching at home knew, was what had happened 30 minutes before she walked through that curtain. Lucy had arrived at her dressing room composed and ready. She had done her makeup, reviewed her notes, done everything she always did. And then, somewhere in the silence between preparation and showtime, she had sat down in front of the vanity mirror and looked at herself for a long time. On the mirror's edge, folded and refolded until the creases were soft, was the review. The 1973 review, the one with the word in it. She had propped it there the way she always did before a performance she was uncertain about, using fear as fuel or as punishment. She was never entirely sure which. She later confided to her husband, Gary Morton, that in that dressing room, 30 minutes before the taping, she had genuinely believed she couldn't do it. Not the way it needed to be done. She had thought with a clarity that frightened her. What if they're right? Gary Morton had come in 15 minutes before showtime. He hadn't given a speech. He had simply placed a black and white photograph on the vanity beside the review. Lucy on the I Love Lucy set, 1952, mid-fall, completely ridiculous, completely alive, and said 4 words. Go find her, Lou. Have you ever had someone believe in you at the exact moment you'd stopped believing in yourself? Tell us in the comments. Because what Johnny said to Lucy in a quiet corridor when the cameras were off, that is the part of this story that changes everything. The corridor outside Studio One was narrow and fluorescent and not the kind of place anyone would choose for a significant conversation. It smelled like cable wire and old carpet and the particular staleness of a building that never fully emptied. Johnny found Lucy there after the taping, still in her performance clothes, the silk scarf now folded neatly over one arm. The audience had gone. The crew was breaking down the set. The cameras were dark. There was no show left to perform. "Lucy," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't expected. Not relief, not anger, something quieter than either. "Johnny," she finally said, "if you had warned me, I would have prepared. And if I had prepared, it wouldn't have been real. For a C and dusty I." She looked at him directly, clear and unhurried and completely herself. "So don't apologize for the only thing tonight that actually helped me." Johnny Carson was not a man who was easily moved, but people who were nearby in that corridor said that something in his face shifted when Lucy said those words. Something loosened. "You scared me," he admitted. "When you paused before picking up the chocolate, I thought you were going to walk off the stage." Lucy smiled. The real one, not the performance one. "I thought about it," she said. "What stopped you?" She considered the question seriously. "I realized," she said slowly, "that walking off would have proved them right. And I have spent my entire life refusing to prove people like that right. 3 days later, Lucy called Johnny's private line from her home on Roxbury Drive in Beverly Hills. She almost hung up twice before he answered. She had called to say thank you. And what Johnny said in return, quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, would stay with her for the remaining 15 years of her life. "Lucy," he said, "the only thing I did tonight was refuse to let you hide. Everything else was you. It was always, only ever you." Lucille Ball worked for 15 more years after that February night. She performed, she produced, she mentored, she showed up. She stopped reading reviews. Not out of arrogance, but out of something harder to come by and more durable. Clarity. She had learned at 62 years old in front of 400 people and 20 million more at home that the gift did not diminish. It only went quiet when you stopped trusting it. And she had decided in the space between picking up a gold-wrapped chocolate and looking into a camera that she would never stop trusting it again. In 1989, Lucille Ball made her final television appearance. She was 77 years old. She was still funny. She was still sharp. She still made the room reorganize itself around her when she walked in. She died 6 weeks later on April 26th of an acute aortic aneurysm. The tributes that followed came from every corner of American life, from presidents and comedians and ordinary people who had grown up watching her and felt in the particular way that great performers make you feel that they had lost someone who belonged to them. Johnny Carson devoted the opening of his Tonight Show monologue to her the night after she died. He did not tell jokes. He stood at his mark and spoke for 4 minutes without notes, and people who were in the studio said he did not look like a television host. He looked like a man who had lost a friend. He kept a photograph on his desk at NBC for the rest of his tenure. A still from February 19th, 1974. Lucy, mid-motion, the studio audience behind her, blurred and open-mouthed with laughter. He never explained why it was there. He didn't have to. What happened in those 10 minutes was never just a television moment. It was a demonstration of something people spend their whole lives trying to understand. That real talent is not a thing you lose. It is a thing you doubt. And the difference between the people who let doubt win and the people who don't often comes down to a single moment. A dare, a chocolate, a voice that says, "Go find her." When someone who sees you more clearly than you see yourself refuses to let you disappear. Lucille Ball did not disappear. She never did. She only needed someone to remind her. If this story moved you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, who believed in you when you'd stopped believing in yourself? We read every single one.